Good morning, everyone. Happy solstice. And in Canada, today is National Indigenous Peoples Day. Just want to recognize that. I want to take the opportunity this morning to just thank many people and organizations for helping make this meeting possible. First, we have a few sponsors for the meeting. Natural Resources Canada and the Ontario Ministry of Northern Development, Mines, Natural Resources and Forestry have provided funding and in-kind salary support for myself and many of the organizing committee. The Centre for Forest Research, also known as Centre d'études de la forêt, which is a research group that includes 11 universities in Quebec. They have provided all of the IT and tech support to develop the website and manage the online platform. It's been amazing. I would especially like to thank Tech and Luc Lauzon, who did an enormous amount of work to make the event happen and who have also been really a pleasure to work with. Thanks also to Paul Rogers and the Western Aspen Alliance for hosting our happy hour on Thursday evening. A special thanks to Laurie Springall, who is our event planner and go-to person for interacting with the participants. Laurie has done an amazing job at juggling many tasks and people at the same time. And if you see her in the event space, please say hi and thanks. I'd also like to thank the organizing committee for their support and hard work over this past year. Amanda Rowe, Shalene Haynes, and Trevor Jones, who are research scientists with NRCan. Dave Morris and Stephen Mayer, who are research scientists with the Ontario Ministry of Northern Development, Mines, Natural Resources and Forestry. Tim Work, who's a professor at the University of Quebec at Montreal. Pedro Antunes, a professor at Algoma University here in the Sioux. And Carrie Wenio-Kaiser, who's an environmental technician at NRCan. I also really want to thank all of the moderators for their willingness to take on some extra responsibility. I think they all did an excellent job yesterday. I was very impressed, and I expect that will continue this week. And lastly, I'd like to thank everyone who has volunteered to evaluate student presentations and posters. We still need a few judges for a few sessions today and on Thursday and Friday. Today, if you will be in Climate Change 2 or Sustainable Forest Management 3 and would be willing to evaluate some student presentations, please contact Laurie as soon as possible. And then we're also looking for judges on Thursday and Friday. So if you're available and willing, please get in touch with Laurie. Just a few reminders, sessions are being recorded, so your participation in the sessions will be taken as permission to record and share content. Please take some time to visit posters and leave some comments. The poster presenters would love to hear from you. They've put a lot of work into those posters and would like to get some comments back from people and generate some discussion. Please also take time to visit the White Pines room to check out the workouts. They're open 24/7. As usual, if you have any issues during the day, contact Laurie Springall and she'll sort you out. Laurie's generally hanging out at the conference welcome table, but you can also find her by going to the participants list. That's at the bottom right of the status bar in Gather, searching on Laurie, L-O-R-I-E, and then left clicking on her name. And from here, you can either message her or follow her to locate her. Just a reminder that tomorrow is a break day. Traditionally, NAFEW has a conference tour day on Wednesday. We decided to keep that structure to give people a chance to catch up on other aspects of their life. So Gather will be open all day if you want to connect with people at the meeting. We encourage you to visit the workout room, take some time to visit and comment on posters. On Thursday, the schedule is a little bit different in that our keynote talk will be at the end of the day at 3:40 Eastern Daylight Time in the Algoma room. And then as usual in the morning, we will have brief announcements from 11 to 11:15, and then our talk sessions will begin at 11:15. So make note of that change in the schedule on Thursday. Lastly, about 30 people spent the night in Gather. So we do recommend that you sign out at the end of the day and close your browser, and not just the tab, but the whole browser. And that will keep things running smoothly. You can sign out by going to the main menu on the bottom left of the status bar. That's the bunch of grapes. That's the Gather icon. And you'll see there the sign out option. I had a great day yesterday listening to some really good talks and participating in some really interesting discussions, and I don't expect today will be any different. Our keynote speaker today is Dr. Jennifer Baltzer. Dr. Baltzer is a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Forests and Global Change at Wilfrid Laurier University, and her work focuses on the drivers of forest composition, structure, and function, and responses of these systems to global change. She's worked in a range of systems from tropics to the tundra and currently leads an extensive boreal forest research program throughout the Northwest Territories. Her interdisciplinary research program examines the impacts of climate warming, including permafrost thaw, wildfire regimes, and biome shifts on the distribution and function of high-latitude boreal forests and its implication for northern communities. Within Canada, she works closely with the government of the Northwest Territories through a 20-year partnership agreement. Dr. Baltzer plays leadership roles in NASA's Above campaign, the Smithsonian Institute's Forest Geo Network, and the CFREF-funded Global Waters Future Program. In 2017, Dr. Baltzer was elected to the Royal Society of Canada's College of New Scholars, Artists, and Scientists. Dr. Baltzer's talk today, the title is A Changing Boreal Landscape, the Role of Fire and Permafrost Thaw in Modifying Forest Composition and Function. And with that, I give you Dr. Jennifer Baltzer.
Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can see this, Lisa. We got it. You can see this okay?
I can, yes.
Okay, wonderful. First of all, I love that everyone had a big sleepover in Gather last night. That's pretty great. And second, I'm really delighted to be here, and thank you, Lisa, for the lovely introduction and the invitation to join the meeting. As Lisa mentioned, I'm going to be talking about some work that we've been doing in the Northwest Territories, and I just want to flag this picture here. This was a really fun science art collaboration that I did with Ryan Brynjolfsson, and this is Ryan's take on massive ground ice in northern environments and the sort of deformation of the land surface as those ice wedges thaw and trees are disrupted physically. So a little shout out to science art collaboration. Okay, so thanks again for the nice introduction, and we'll just move on from here. So first of all, I'd like to acknowledge my many co-authors that have been involved in the work that I'm going to be presenting today. As we go through the talk, you'll see some pictures, some people's faces flagged throughout that. These are students who have led the work that I'm going to be presenting on, and their Twitter handles are there. They're pretty awesome researchers, so please feel free to give them a follow if you're on Twitter. One thing I'd like to mention is that the work that I'm presenting today is work that's taken place on the territories of a lot of different Indigenous communities in the Northwest Territories. And here we just have a map of various settled and unsettled land claim regions in the Northwest Territories. Okay, so to get started, just a little introduction, probably not necessary for most of you, but a little introduction to the Boreal Biome. The Boreal Biome it forms a green ring around the top of the planet. It's one of the largest intact forested biomes on the planet. In terms of above ground biomass, it's not a very productive system, but it plays a huge role in terms of carbon storage in terms of below ground carbon. So here we have a map of above ground biomass. The boreal is the main disturbance agent in boreal ecosystems is wildfire. Here we have a map of average area burned across different boreal regions. And the other piece that I'm going to draw your attention to is the fact that much of the boreal occurs on permafrost. We have management that occurs through various portions of the boreal, and overall the human impact is relatively low compared to other regions. Okay, so for many of you, these will be pretty familiar faces. Some dominant species from boreal North America. Here we have black spruce, which is the most widespread and dominant species in boreal North America. There are some deciduous taxa that play a big role. Here we have aspen and paper birch. And a couple of other important conifers that will come up through the talk today. One is jack pine, another serotinous conifer, and larch, eastern larch, which is a deciduous conifer. All right, so high latitude systems, including the boreal biome, are warming really fast. This shows the global temperature anomalies for 2017, and we see that the high latitudes, the high northern latitudes of the planet are showing really large anomalies. And this is leading to changes in a couple of components that are really quite important to boreal systems. One of these is permafrost, which I already mentioned. So permafrost is ground that's perennially at or below 0 degrees Celsius. So a warming climate means changes to the conditions that support permafrost. And the other is wildfire. As the climate warms and these systems dry out and become, they have a greater fuel load. We're also seeing with climate warming in high northern latitudes, we're seeing increases in lightning strikes. So what we're seeing is an increase in wildfire activity in boreal ecosystems. So I'm going to be touching on both of these things today and then kind of bring them together at the end of the talk. All right, so in terms of permafrost, for those of you not familiar with permafrost landscapes, this is sort of taking a cross section from north to south through, in this case, from Nunavik in the Northwest Territories down to Fort McMurray and northern Alberta. And what we see in these systems is in more northerly places, we have really thick and deep permafrost. It's very cold. And the active layer, which is the layer that thaws and refreezes seasonally, is really quite thin. So this is really stable permafrost. It's continuous. You find it everywhere in the landscape. And then as you move further south and the climate is a bit warmer, permafrost becomes more fragmented in the landscape. It's not as deep, it's not as cold, and the active layer is thicker. And this continues. We see less and less permafrost in the landscape, and it becomes more and more kind of vulnerable to temperature changes as we move further and further south until it disappears entirely. For those of you who have not seen permafrost soils, here's a few cores taken by folks in my group. We've got a nice big ice lens here, various types of ice throughout these two different cores, a really ice poor core of permafrost. And this is a core from organic soils. So this is peat soil that's in a permafrost state. Okay, so just to get oriented, I already showed you a map of the Indigenous territories that we work in, but the work I'm presenting today is really throughout this Mackenzie River region. And this image shows a map of the distribution of boreal forest. And so this green lower edge is the southern extent of boreal forest. And the blue colors are different types of permafrost that we just saw in the previous map. So from isolated to continuous permafrost. And the studies that I'm going to present to you today all kind of come from this region. All right, so in the Mackenzie region, there's really widespread evidence of lowland thermokarst, and thermokarst is abrupt thaw. So in some parts of permafrost landscapes, we have thaw that can happen without having really very much impact on the landscape. And other places where there's a lot of ice in the ground, like those more ice-rich cores that I showed you, thaw can lead to really abrupt changes in the landscape. And we have a couple of examples of this here on the right-hand side. Here's a lovely little circular collapsed scar bog with Carolyn Gibson, who did this work standing in the middle. You can see that the ground surface subsides as that ice melts and the water runs off of the land surface. Same kind of thing here, where we have the edge of a spruce lichen woodland thawing out, and you can see this trough of water at the edge that is really the water coming off of the thawing permafrost. And the ground subsides, the trees kind of topple over. And so we have really widespread evidence for this kind of thermokarst in the Mackenzie River Valley. So on the left-hand side, the other right, on the left-hand side, we have a map that was determined using sentinel imagery of the extent of permafrost peatlands throughout this region. And so the darker red colors are the places where you have much more extensive coverage of permafrost peatland in those sentinel grid cells. And on the right-hand side, Carolyn went in and looked at a lot of these peatlands with using higher resolution imagery and looked for evidence of these kinds of signatures, these thaw features. And so what we have is the distribution of Red areas being really areas where we have a lot of thermokarst happening in these peatlands, and yellow areas is where it's very low. And so we have this latitudinal gradient of thaw, with southern regions showing really rapid thaw already, and northern regions not seeing that as much yet, and this mid-latitude region kind of transitioning. So in these boreal permafrost peatlands, black spruce is the dominant player. These will be kind of familiar types of pictures to many of you. This is from a mapped forest plot in the Northwest Territories near Fort Simpson. It's part of the Forest Geo Network, and every dot on that map is a stem that's greater than 1 centimeter diameter at breast height, and the different colors correspond to different species. The blue is black spruce. And so you can see that from both this stem distribution graph and the map, that black spruce is really the dominant species in this system by far. Now, as I already mentioned, lateral thaw. So in the zone of discontinuous permafrost, remember we have patches of permafrost in the landscape, and so they're kind of like, islands of permafrost in permafrost-free wetter areas. And so lateral thaw or horizontal thaw leads to spruce forest loss in these permafrost peatlands, and you saw these pictures already, and we talked through them. But there's also vertical thaw that's happening. So thaw from the ground surface down, so a thickening of the active layer. And some work that Rajat Patankar and Anna Snyderhan and my group have led shows that from a couple of perspectives, we see evidence of drought stress in black spruce in response to these vertical thaw processes. So these are sap flow data from trees sitting on plateau edges where their roots are waterlogged. You can see their sap flow is really low, and they're not really responsive to the frost table depth because they're stressed because of waterlogged conditions. In the plateau interiors, though, we see as the frost table deepens, the average daily sap flow decreases. And so we have this negative relationship between sap flow, or the water moving through the plant for transpiration, and frost table depth. This is supported from some dendro work that Anna Snyderhan led. She looked at basal area increments of trees in the same system through time. So we had sort of stable growth across in the 40s and 50s, and then we see this declining trend of basal area increment that suggests a decrease in growth through time. Anna also looked at the stable carbon isotopes in those tree rings, and we see a corresponding negative trend in stable carbon isotopes. And what this tells us is, plants close their stomates in response to, as plants close their stomates, they preferentially take up carbon-13. And so this gives us a measure of how tightly closed the tree's stomates were in a given ring width period. And a couple of, in terms of the relationships between these two variables, when we see increases in basal area increment with a corresponding decrease in delta 13C, this gives us an indication of carbon fertilization, because the plant is able to maintain or increase its basal area increment despite having its stomates closed longer. This suggests that it's responding positively to increased atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations. When we see this negative relationship where we have both negative basal area increment and negative delta 13C, this tells us that the stomates were closed in response to drought. So plants will close their stomates to avoid water loss. And so both of these lines of evidence suggest that vertical thaw in these permafrost peatlands can drive drought stress in black spruce. Okay, so in addition to that, we have information from this mapped forest plot about with respect to dynamic data. So the mapped forest plot was established in 2013 and recensused in 2018. And these are data on sort of net changes in stems. So the mortality and recruitment dynamics from the site. And each of the squares in this is a 20 by 20 meter grid cell. And blue colors indicate a net decrease in stems, and red colors indicate a net increase in stems. And we can see that across the plot, we're seeing pretty widespread decreases when we look at all species together, and particularly when we look at black spruce. So lots of blue grid cells indicating a net decrease in stems. We can look at the causes of these. A major cause is waterlogging, and we see that happening along these edges of open areas where wetlands are expanding and thaw is occurring, and this sort of waterlogging mortality is occurring. But the most prevalent cause of mortality was what we classified as biologic or unknown. and it was distributed across permafrost plateaus. When we related that to thaw rates in those same grid cells, we saw that areas that had higher thaw rates had higher rates of this gray category of mortality, suggesting that not only are we seeing drought stress in response to this vertical thaw, but that the drought stress is either causing mortality directly or causing the trees to be more susceptible to other mortality agents. And so this widespread kind of net loss of trees should lead to a decrease in productivity of the system. But this seems not to be the case. So these are data from showing Landsat Ndvi trends, so the slope of the Ndvi values over the last 30 years. And these are significant trends. These are non-significant trends. So each of the squares in this is a 30 by 30 meter Landsat pixel, and the plot outline is overlaid here. So what we see is that across the board, we're seeing greening trends, and the only significant trends are greening trends. So overall in this plot, we're seeing increases in productivity as detected by satellite remote sensing. This was a little bit surprising to us. So we took a look at some of the predictors of this. And the thing that jumps out in both when we look at sort of the species that are associated with portions of the plot that are greening and the recruitment dynamics that are associated with portions of the plot that are greening is that those places in the landscape that had a lot of larynx, or where larynx was recruiting in a widespread way, are the places that were showing the strongest greening trends. And indeed, we saw as this landscape is changing, as black spruce is being lost from the landscape, we see widespread increases in larch across the landscape. So larch is able to come in and take advantage of these thawed conditions, leading in part to increases in productivity that we're seeing. So this is just a little schematic of that. We have these black spruce forests that are declining, lots of larch recruits in these new permafrost-free areas, and places where we had strong recruitment of larch are places that we have the strongest greening trends. Okay, so we wanted to take a look at, the trees make up a portion of this environment, but the ground vegetation is a really important player in these kind of low productivity boreal ecosystems as well. And Catherine Standen, who just recently completed her PhD, sampled ground vegetation communities in areas with shallow, medium, and deep active layers. So these are the most deeply thawed portions of the landscape. So she looked at both community composition, and she also measured plant functional traits. And so by combining these two, she was able to come up with community-weighted physiological rates. So mass-based photosynthetic rate, respiration, nitrogen, and specific leaf area. And what we see is that when you move from shallow active layers to deeper active layers, the community level traits become more productive. So we have higher photosynthetic rates, higher respiration rates, et cetera. And she partitioned the variance associated with that to determine, is this a plastic response or is it because of species turnover? And found that by and large, compositional shifts in these plant communities were what was driving changes in the community level function. So again, like we saw in the plot level example, turnover of species is leading to an enhancement of productivity in this system. Okay, so now scaling up. We were really interested. So all the work I've shown you to date is from a single site near Fort Simpson. We wanted to see, okay, well, what can we see across larger areas? And this was a master's thesis of Emily Ogden, who just recently completed her master's in my group. And there's a wonderful network of sites that was established by Sharon Smith from the Geologic Survey of Canada. And at each of the points on this graph, and this is, the Mackenzie River Valley again, we have Great Slave Lake, Great Bear Lake, just to orient you. At each of these sites, Sharon established a permanent ground temperature monitoring where she put in deep strings of thermistors. And this allows us to look at changes in permafrost conditions at all of these sites. And so some of the sites were established as early as 1984, which corresponds really nicely to the Landsat record. So what Emily did was take a look at the relationships between these permafrost conditions and satellite-based measures of greening, so increases in Ndvi through time, or browning, which are decreases in Ndvi through time. And what we can see is in the early time periods, in 1984 to 2000, most of the sites are greening. We're seeing really positive greening increases in productivity. As we move to the later time period, we see significant increases both in the number of sites that are browning significantly, so these dark brown sites, and the number of sites, and a significant decrease in the number of sites that are greening significantly, so the dark green triangles. And so there's a change happening between these time periods. In the early time period, it was predominantly increases in productivity. This is changing in the later time period, particularly down in these more southerly locations. And so Emily put this all together in a boosted regression tree analysis, and this is the partial dependency plots from that. Just to walk you through these, here we have different predictors, and each predictor that was included to predict the delta Ndvi, the percent of variance explained in the model is indicated here. So latitude, we see 32% of the variation in delta Ndvi explained by latitude. And the pattern we see here is that at low and high latitudes, we have much smaller delta Ndvi values compared to mid latitudes, which sort of corresponds to what we saw in the previous slide. The other thing I want to draw your attention to is this variable proportion thawed, or the change in proportion thawed, sorry. We looked at the top 2 meters of the soil profile, because this is really where, kind of the deepest rooting depths that have been documented for the species that occur in these systems. And so a negative proportion thawed is actually aggradation. So permafrost, the frost table is becoming more superficial, the active layer is becoming thinner. And a large positive value is where we see large rates of thaw happening through that profile. And what this pattern shows us is, that it's really at these sort of initial, kind of the initialization of thaw that we see the strongest positive response of Ndvi to thaw rates. And that this stabilizes after, at larger proportional changes in thaw, and is fairly low when we have aggradation or shallow active layers. So these two things combined sort of suggest that the positive effects of thaw may be ephemeral, that they may not be sustained with continued thaw. This is certainly suggested by the fact that the southerly sites in the Northwest Territories that have experienced the most substantial thaw are showing fairly low delta Ndvi values, coupled with this response to proportional thaw. Okay, so just to sort of conclude that section, forest productivity is enhanced despite widespread forest conversion. So conversion of these, black spruce dominated areas to kind of these permafrost-free larch dominated forest types. Our data suggests that shifts in forest community composition are really important in understanding these changes in productivity that are happening in these systems. But finally, that this productivity response to thaw may be an ephemeral response, that it may not be sustained over a longer time period. Okay, so moving on to the second part, which has to do with wildfire and land cover change. And as many or all of you know, wildfire is a really critical part of boreal ecosystems. It's essential for renewal of these forests. It's the main natural disturbance that happens on these landscapes. And we see lots of amazing adaptations of species to wildfire in these systems. I have here cones of black spruce. Black spruce is semi-serotinous, and as a fire burns through, it heats up the resin on the cone sort of slowly opens onto a fresh seed bed, and black spruce is able to self-replace. Jack pine is similar, and we have other great adaptations that are really focused on resprouting that allow really rapid recovery following wildfire in the system. So it's a really important part of boreal ecosystems. But increasingly, we're seeing headlines like this where we're seeing just evidence of these unprecedented fire seasons happening, particularly in Western Canada. And this isn't just headlines. Here's a graph of burned area in Western North America, and starting in the 1960s and going to more or less present day. And we see this positive, this increase in burned area through time. This is corresponding with an increase in frequency of fires and an increase in the severity of fires. And so we're overall, with climate warming, we're seeing, an acceleration of the fire regime in boreal ecosystems. The summer of 2014 was really an unprecedented fire year in the Northwest Territories. This graph shows the total area burned in hectares. So in 2014, the Northwest Territories saw 3.5 million hectares of forested land impacted by wildfire. It was really, really a very, just a really massive fire year in this area that impacted, many communities in the Northwest Territories, and the impacts of the smoke from this fire year were widespread. And this is in comparison to the gray bar, which is the 25-year average, and the white bar, which is 2015. So this map shows the distribution of fire scars in the landscape, and these dark orange ones are correspond with the 2014 fires predominantly. In response to this large fire event, myself and quite a number of colleagues set up an NWT-wide network, well, not quite NWT-wide, but throughout the Clecho, Decho, and Sawtooth regions, a network of sites to really start to better understand the fire ecology in this system, in particular in response to this really severe wildfire year. At each of these sites, we co-located measurements of combustion. So we looked at total and legacy carbon, tree regeneration. So you can see our little regeneration plots, ground vegetation recovery, permafrost conditions, and then around a range of stand features, including pre-fire stand structure and composition, time since last fire as measured using tree rings. And today I'm just going to be talking about tree regeneration, but if anyone's interested in some of these other components, feel free to find me in Gather Town, and we can talk more about any of these other components. So this should, I'm just going to move this over so you guys can see this picture first. This should have been animated, but a lot of what we were focused on in this effort was, testing this model that Jill Johnstone had developed for Alaska, where this is sort of the historic self-replacement of black spruce, where you have a black spruce stand, it burns, some of this organic layer, which is indicated by these hash marks, is combusted. The cones of black spruce open, release their seed on the seed bed, and we have black spruce self-replacement. Now, what Jill found in Alaska was that short fire return intervals or severe fire could cause a shift away from black spruce and toward deciduous, post-fire deciduous dominance, and specifically aspen. And so, there we go, there's our animation. That's kind of what this looks like. So we have black spruce and then severe wildfire or short interval fire leading to a forest like that. And so you can imagine that, from an ecosystem function perspective, from any number of reasons, lots of changes that go hand in hand with that. So we evaluated this in our system. The Northwest Territories is a bit different from Alaska. We have, biogeographically, it's different because we have, species like jack pine that do not occur past the Rocky Mountains. And so these are data taken from the Taiga Shield and the Taiga Plains region in the Northwest Territories. This is a principal coordinates analysis where we have pre-fire conditions as the tail of the arrow and post-fire conditions as the head of the arrow. So each of these arrows indicates a single site and its shift from post-fire to pre-fire in terms of tree species composition and abundance. All of the orange arrows indicate a shift away from black spruce dominance pre-fire. And so, the first takeaway is that we see an awful lot of orange arrows here. But the second takeaway is that, the shift that we saw was really dependent on the ecoregion. So on the Taiga Shield, we see this, that most sites that did not recover to black spruce shifted toward paper birch recovery. And those sites in the taiga plains that shifted away from black spruce, it was kind of split between recovering to jack pine or recovering to aspen. But the majority of the sites, so black spruce lost dominance at 43% of sites in the taiga plains and 30% on the shield. So this is a really substantial change, compositional change for a species that has historically self-replaced. And it's really unusual for a serotinous species to not self-replace following fire. So we're seeing some changes happening in this landscape, similar to what Jill saw in Alaska. And that Nicola took a look at, I should have highlighted Nicola. This is the postdoc who worked on this project, Nicola Day. And Nicola also took a look at a number of predictors, and the key predictors that came out as being really quite important for this loss of resilience were residual soil organic layer depth, so how much soil organic layer was left after the fire, and stand age, so how recent was the last fire that stand experienced. And we see negative relationships for both. So these are sites in the taiga plains, these are sites in the taiga shield. This is the shift from black spruce to jack pine, which is more common when you have shallow residual soil organic layers and young stands. And the same holds true for the shift from black spruce to birch, where we have shallow residual organic layers and young stands. We see much higher frequency of transition from black spruce to birch. So the outlook from this is that deeper burning, more frequent fires will lead to more frequent state changes in this system. And so we're scaling this one up too. So we wanted to take a look at, how widespread are these losses of resilience across boreal North America? And so we pulled together a synthesis that involved, scientists from across North America, and included about 1,500 sample plots across 11 ecozones and an awful lot of seedlings that were counted by many, many people. To be included in the synthesis, we needed at least information on the post-fire seedling counts and identities. Pre-fire, we needed information on pre-fire stand composition to be able to evaluate how frequently we're seeing shifts away from the pre-fire condition post-fire. And we needed information on some environmental variables, including information on burn severity, as well as things like site drainage. Okay, so this is kind of the distribution of sites across North America. And we categorize these, I'm not going to get into the details of how these were categorized, but we categorize these into 5 different categories. Regeneration failure, poor establishment, and competition are these yellow and orange and red bars. And these correspond with post-fire outcomes that we think are not resilient outcomes. So regeneration failure is where there were no seedlings that recruited. Poor establishment is where we see a decrease in density and dominance of the species in question, in this case, black spruce. And competition is where, black spruce or conifers more generally recruited well, but other things did as well. So you have a higher competition environment. We know, at least for black spruce, it's not very fast growing. Jack pine, aspen, birch, they're all going to outcompete that species to reach the canopy first. So we consider these orange and red categories to be non-resilient outcomes. And then density reduction and self-replacement. So the dark blue bar is self-replacement, where black spruce maintains density or dominance and either increases or maintains density. And density reduction is the light blue bars. And this is particularly important in Eastern North America. And there's some additional nuance there that I'm not going to get into, but overall, we see, a fairly high amount of resilience. So for black spruce, we see about 60% of sites being resilient to wildfire, but that means about 40% of sites aren't. And this varies by ecoregion. So the Cordillera and the Taiga Plains West both had much lower levels of resilience, with up to 60% shifts away from black spruce toward one of these other outcomes. We wanted to look at drivers of post-fire regeneration outcomes. We used a random forest analysis for this. There's a whole range of variables: residual organic layer, thickness, site drainage, normal climate moisture deficit, and climate moisture deficit anomalies in the 2 years post-fire. Time after fire is determined by tree ring analysis, the ecozone, canopy combustion that was measured in the field, and stand basal area, which can be a good indication of seed availability. And we see that for both conifer resilience and black spruce resilience, that site drainage, residual organic layer thickness, and climate moisture deficit, the normal, the 30-year normal, are all coming out as top variables in this analysis. And for black spruce resilience, the basal area is important as well. The seed availability from pre-fire is a really important determinant of what the outcome will be post-fire. And this is what some of these look like. So when we have thin residual organic layers, we have non-resilient outcomes. When we have thicker residual organic layers, we tend to have these more resilient outcomes. Likewise for climate moisture deficit, where we have high climate moisture deficits, we're more likely to see shifts away from black spruce compared to wetter environments. And this really reflected an east-west gradient in climate. Okay, so in terms of an outlook under an intensified fire regime, we took a look at these non-resilient outcomes, these orange and red bars. What happened to those sites post-fire, and is this consistent across boreal North America? And so this is what this graph is showing us. Yellow is regeneration failure, so complete regeneration failure where no trees recruited into those sites post-fire. So this is a situation where you end up with maybe a grassland or a shrub, a shrub-dominated system. And this was fairly frequent, particularly in the Alaskan boreal interior. In Western Canada, deciduous outcomes were quite common where black spruce failed to regenerate. Which deciduous species was the most important depended on region. So birch in the Cordillera and the Taiga Shield West, and aspen in the Alaskan boreal interior and Plains West. And then jack pine was really important in Eastern Canada, as well as in the Taiga Plains, in the Western Taiga Plains. So the post-fire outcome where black spruce was not resilient was really was quite variable across North America. And we've in a lot of modeling efforts, they've really focused on this transition from black spruce to aspen as the key transition where black spruce fails to recruit. But we see that this is really quite variable as you move across across regions in North America. And this is just kind of a map of what these different outcomes would look like, the top outcomes for each region. And so we can see how different, these sites where black spruce was not resilient post-fire, how variable they are in terms of their outcome. Okay, and so just to sort of bring these things together, I want to draw your attention to the idea of compounding disturbances. And so a lot of parts of the boreal are underlain by permafrost and experience wildfire. And in those southerly places where permafrost is ecosystem protected or ecosystem driven, that is the vegetation protects the permafrost because it's in a climate. So here we have climate across the top from high Arctic down to cold temperate. So these ecosystem protected parts of the landscape are in climates where permafrost doesn't regrade because the climate has shifted away from has become warmer. And so it's in these parts of the landscape where we expect disturbance to, like wildfire, to lead to thaw and potential additional sort of compounding changes to post-fire outcomes. And so this is some of the work that we're really focusing on now, and work that PhD student Caitlin Lyons and collaborator Catherine Dielman are focused on, is thinking about these lags in forest response post-fire in permafrost landscapes. And a lot of those landscape positions where we have ecosystem protected permafrost are parts of the landscape that were resilient. So they're poorly drained locations with thick residual organic layers. These are also the places where disturbance is going to cause a change in the permafrost conditions. And so we're revisiting a lot of those sites now that we're close to a decade past that fire event, to evaluate whether there are lags in these forest responses when fire initiates thaw. So stay tuned for that. Great work being led by these folks. And with that, I will stop and thank you and acknowledge my funders and show you another one of Ryan's wonderful paintings. This is actually the forest plot, and each of these holes represents a tree that senesced during the plot recensus. And I'll take any questions.
Thanks, Jennifer. That was really interesting. Very sorry for the technical difficulties today. Yeah, as you say, you weren't the only one. We had a little bit of trouble getting some people onto the meeting today too. So it's the curse of the virtual conference.
Well, happily, I had less animation than I thought. So
that's good. I'm going to encourage folks to raise their hands. Let me see if I can access to raise their hands if they have questions. And I have a question a couple of questions in the Q&A section, so I'll read those out. Just see, I'm just going to make sure I've got access to the participants list here. Okay. From Paul Rogers, you use the words outcome and resilience often in the fire section of the presentation, as if these were terminal stages of forest dynamics. Perhaps you did not mean that. Can you discuss timeframes of your data and longer-term forest dynamics in your estimation of the permanence of these changes away from black spruce to other broadleaf or conifer forest types?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that question. I didn't have enough time to get into the nuance there, but there's, you know, in these boreal systems, we have, stand replacing fires that come through, and we typically have an even age stand that results following those wildfires. And so the seedlings that recruit initially after fire they're the species that form the canopy, at least over the first kind of 100-year time frame. So where I'm working in Western Canada, our fire return intervals between 70 and 100 years. So if you have seedlings recruiting into that system that form the canopy, and lifespans of aspen or jack pine or black spruce, or aspen would be the shortest lived, but it's going to live to be 70, 100 years likely. So you don't have the opportunity for relay succession to happen in those short fire return interval, well, short-ish fire return interval context. And so we've actually gone back and remeasured a bunch of sites that were established. So Jill has done some of this work in Alaska and the Yukon, and we've done some in the Northwest Territories, sites that were established following fires in the 90s and early 2000s. And we see that those species that recruited immediately post-fire, so in the first 3-4 years post-fire, they're still the dominant players 20 or 30 years out. And so that really sets the stage for what these forests will look like until, if you're right, if the fire return interval lengthens, so if deciduous taxa, for example, being less flammable, reduce the flammability of the landscape, and that forest is able to succeed, it may very well be the case that we end up with black spruce returning to those sites, after 80 years or 100 years. But in the current context of Western North America, at least, where we have, 70, 80 year fire return intervals, that's less likely to happen. Does that answer your question?
I don't know if Paul can answer that. A question from Amanda Rowe. Have you noticed whether there are changes in the insect disturbance regimes along with other disturbance events?
So, I mean, I know very generally, and I see lots of names on this participant list who would be able to answer this question much better than I would. I know very generally that warming is leading to an increase in insect pest disturbances, greater overwintering success, these sorts of things. There's a big focus in the Northwest Territories by forest managers on insect pest surveys. And so those are happening pretty regularly, but this is not something that I've looked at, Amanda, and don't feel like I can. I'm sure that, you or others on this call would be able to actually address that much better than I would. But it's certainly a consideration, right? It's an additional disturbance that plays with these other, particularly with wildfire. And so really important to bring those different pieces together.
Barry Cook says willow leaf miner. I don't know if that was in response to that question or if you're familiar with willow leaf miner, but.
Well, there's lots of leaf miner activity. I know that that's one of the big concerns is, I mean, I've been up as far as, as far north as Fort Good Hope and seen really intense leaf miner activity up there. So I don't know if that's unusual for that region. Barry or someone else, I'm sure, could comment on that. But yeah, there's a lot of leaf miner activity for sure.
Barry says there was an incredible outbreak of willow leaf miner 2011 to 2012 prior to the 2014 fire season.
Yeah, so there was a really extended drought leading up to the 2014 wildfire season. So there was, 4 or 5 years of drought that set the stage for that. Drought stressed plants typically can't deal with insect pests as well. So that makes a lot of sense, and probably, yeah.
Just backing up, Paul Rogers says, thanks, Jennifer, for your thorough reply to my question on long-term changes versus permanence in black spruce change.
You're welcome,
so I guess
Paul.
You answered his question. That's awesome. Okay, Terry Porter says, have you had a chance to look at how fungal succession may play a role in these shifts where thawing is occurring?
That's a really cool question. And Nicola, whose work I presented here, has been doing some awesome stuff in these sites. I am not a fungal person, but she was, and I was really lucky to have her in, or she is, I should say. She's not with me anymore, but she's still with us. So I was really lucky to have her in my group, and she did some really great sequencing work post-fire, looking at fungal communities across this burned landscape, and found really strong impacts of fire severity via impacts on pH, on soil pH, on the fungal community. She also looked at, she cultured heat-resistant fungi from these landscapes, and so looked at the impact of these heat-resistant fungi on tree growth and decomposition, and found that those heat-resistant fungi were pretty good decomposers, but they had, at least for black spruce, had negative impacts on growth. So some interesting post-fire fungal dynamics there. In terms of permafrost thaw, we had the opportunity to core some of these sites. So we took permafrost cores that, and she inoculated seedlings. So she did the sequencing work through the core, and we definitely see differences in fungal community composition through these permafrost cores, from the active layer to kind of the transient zone where it thaws and refreezes in response to disturbance, to the more to those sort of basal permafrost. And she inoculated tree seedlings with those with soils from each of those layers, and found that mycorrhiza from each of those layers were still viable mycorrhizal spores in the deep permafrost that were able to actually form a partnership with black spruce. And I'm trying to remember she did some growth studies, and I'm not sure if she's analyzed those data. So to answer your question, it's really interesting because there's changes in permafrost community or fungal community composition through these permafrost profiles. You still have viable spores deep down, and they can still partner up with current day tree species. So there's lots of really exciting questions to be asked about that. Yeah, so thanks for that question.
A couple of comments from Barry Cook. It's critical we see the truth of northern change. Thank you, Jennifer, and all her colleagues who investigate this incredible change we are witnessing. And along the same lines, Amanda Rose says, I think it's critical that we have eyes in the forests. It's helpful to know what you are seeing in the woods. Thanks for all the work you do to document these changes.
Oh, thanks.
And okay, a question from Kim Chapman. Great presentation, thank you. When you mentioned waterlogging mortality initially, can you tell us how that was assessed?
Basically, it was trees that were dead or fallen over, in waterlogged soils. So we know for black spruce that, based on our own sap flow data and based on work from other great physiological work from other researchers, that the black spruce roots really can't deal with growing in saturated soils. So if we found a tree that was standing dead or had fallen over into waterlogged environment, we classified that as a waterlogging death. In fact, there was one tree that had fallen over. We'd sampled it in 2013. It had died, fallen into a wetland, and had that much sphagnum on top of it already. And my postdoc was looking, Catherine was looking around. She's like, I can't find this tree, it's missing. And then she dug around a little in the sphagnum and found its tag buried deep in the sphagnum. So yeah, anyway, that's how we classified waterlogging mortality.
Okay, thanks. Okay, a note from Jason Shabaga. Aspen leaf miner has become a notable problem around the Fairbanks area over the last few years, which has shifted significantly to birch aspen over the past century. I've observed it as far north as the Yukon River area along the Dalton Highway corridor, but it was not a major pest there. Okay. A message from Florentin. Do you have any idea why Larix is performing well when permafrost thaws?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of factors there. One is that from a waterlogging tolerance, like we were just talking about, larch is better able to deal with having its feet wet. I think the other piece is that when you remove permafrost from a system, you can actually have greater groundwater surface water interactions. And this brings, you know, in these really nutrient poor parts of the landscape, this brings the potential for additional nutrients up to the surface. And so that really is mediated by how thick your organic layer is. But in places where the organic layer isn't crazy thick, you can actually have interchange between groundwater and surface water that can support, you know, the more demanding nature of larch. So I think that's probably why we're seeing that increase. But it's also, you know, it's also noteworthy. There was a nice paper by Steve Mamet and his colleagues that showed they did a global assessment of changes in larch distribution globally, and it seems to be a bit of a winner in terms of climate change. We're seeing, you know, expansion of larch at a global scale throughout the boreal. So yeah, in this context, I think those are the mechanisms, but I think it's a bigger, yeah, a bigger observation probably than what we're seeing locally at that site near Fort Simpson.
Okay, and Barry Cook just adds that all leaf miners on hardwood seem to be early climate change. Oops, sorry, moved on me. Seem to be early responders to climate change. It started with birch leaf miners.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and another message from Kim Chapman. I'm curious if you see an increase in other fen species, sedges, etc., with a shift to larch from black spruce and sphagnum.
Yeah, so I think that, you know, I don't have the community lists, Kim, but Catherine's work certainly, you know, that's what her work suggests. Absolutely, is that we're moving toward these more productive, as these landscapes thaw, we're moving toward these more productive communities, and we absolutely see more fenny species coming into some of those thawed places. Some of them stay as really ombrotrophic bogs, and I think that really is a function of, you know, in some of these landscapes we have such deep peat layers that you can't have that additional nutrient input. But absolutely, in certain parts of that landscape where thaw happens, we see a big increase in you know, more fenny species, and those tend to have those more productive traits that Catherine characterized.
I think that's it for all the questions there. I have one for you. You talked initially about the sort of the communities that in the Northwest Territories, and I'm wondering what sort of the thinking is right now about the implications of these kinds of changes on the people that live in the Northwest Territories.
Yeah, that's a great question, Lisa. I mean, a lot of the work that we were doing with respect to wildfire was, you know, a big concern in the Northwest Territories about these big wildfire events is caribou populations, and a lot of the communities in the Northwest Territories, you know, that's a, you know, really culturally important species. It's a subsistence food resource. And the boreal caribou populations there are pretty healthy, but there was a real interest in understanding how wildfire might impact them, as well as the overwintering habitat of barren ground caribou, which are really not doing as well. So there's always been that really strong link. And we've done a lot of work with this project on lichen recovery and lichen biomass and upscaling that. And so there's that really tight link with caribou and wildlife more generally. So understanding the implications for wildlife habitat of the kinds of land cover changes we're seeing. But there's other components to this. Lots of communities, you know, in lots of communities, people use the land quite a lot, and changing permafrost conditions and wildfire both make the land harder to get around on. And so some of these sort of traditional, you know, being out on the land and traditional livelihoods are impacted by both of these processes. So when we have landscapes thawing out, you know, it's really, really hard to get across those thawed landscapes in lots of situations. Of course, there's the whole ice thing, which is not part of the work that I do, but warming is leading to really big changes in ice conditions in these communities too, and which is a really big problem for connectivity during the winter and kind of safety of harvesters on the land. And then with the wildfires, a lot of, you know, one of the communities we work really closely with, you know, all of their traditional trails were burned during this fire event, and so they had to, you know, they had a really hard time accessing these traditional areas that, because their trails were, they had to do all of this work clearing out their trails. And I think, you know, it's kind of interesting, some of the communities we work in the context of wildfire, there was a, you know, a real split in terms of the concern about the impact of wildfire on wildlife populations, you know, in terms of there's food security links. So the harvesters in the community, who are traditionally men, were not concerned about it. You know, they were just like, okay, well, we'll just go someplace else to harvest while this forest is recovering. The women in the community who had their special berry patches were really upset, and it was a really big impact on them because, you know, their berry patches were impacted, and they really wanted to know how, you know, how quickly will these berry patches recover? Are, you know, so there are a lot of concerns in that context, as well as just the safety of communities. There were evacuations that summer. So I think, you know, there's a really multifaceted impact on communities of these various disturbances. And they really, you know, the communities we work with, these folks really want to know, they really want to have this information so that they can plan forward, because, you know, it's not the northern communities that are creating the massive emissions, and so, yeah, but they're disproportionately impacted, and so there's this challenge of, you know, having to face the reality of adaptation versus any kind of sort of mitigation strategies. And so there's lots of really creative things that are happening in communities to try to respond to and adapt to the changes that they're seeing. And what I've outlined is just a few of the changes that these communities are experiencing. You know, they're really living climate change, right?
Yeah, living on the land. It seems like they'd be massively impacted.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Jennifer. That was a really interesting talk, and thank you for dealing with all those questions. Are you going to be on Gather today a little bit? Yeah. Can people locate you and chat with you?
Yes, we can have our little people join up.
Yeah, okay, awesome. All right, sure. So yeah, if you have any other questions or just wanted to check in with Jennifer, thank her for her talk, you can locate her in the participants list and follow her. You might have a bunch of people following you around, but that's great. Okay, just a couple things. I reviewed with the tech support, and it looks like they are recommending that everyone do a reboot before tomorrow's meeting to try and head off some of the technical problems that we had today. So highly recommend you sign out of Gather at the end of the day and do a reboot in the morning or in the evening to try and get things working well. We have a 15-minute break now till 12:30. At 12:30 in the Roberta Bondar room, we have a special session on ecological silvicultural systems, exemplary models for adaptive forest management. In the Superior room, we have a session of contributed talks on invasive species. And in the Huron room, we have a session on sustainable forest management. And that's all happening at 12:30. Please try and join a couple minutes in advance for the first speaker, and have a great break, and we'll see you soon. Okay, thank you.